The smell of motor oil and rust filled my nostrils as I knelt beside my silver Honda Civic, watching the mechanic's weathered hands trace along the undercarriage. Tommy Martinez had been running Martinez Auto Repair for over 20 years, and I'd never seen his face look quite this serious. His flashlight beam illuminated something that made my stomach drop to the concrete floor. "Mrs. Thompson, you need to see this," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made the busy garage suddenly feel silent. "Your brake lines didn't just fail. They were cut." The words hung in the air like exhaust fumes. Cut. Not worn down. Not corroded. Not damaged by time or weather. Cut. Deliberately. Cleanly. With precision that spoke of intent rather than accident. My husband David stood behind me, and I felt his hand land on my shoulder with what anyone watching would interpret as protective concern. But I knew better. That touch carried a message, a subtle warning wrapped in the performance of a caring spouse. His fingers pressed just a little too firmly, just long enough to remind me who I was supposed to be in this moment. "Oh my God, honey, I'm so sorry." David's voice cracked with what sounded like genuine anguish. "I was working under your car yesterday morning, trying to fix that oil leak that's been dripping on our driveway. I must have accidentally caught the brake line with my wrench when I was reaching for the oil pan. I had no idea I'd damaged it that badly." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tommy's eyebrows furrowed as he examined the cut more closely. The severed brake line was too clean, too precise for an accidental nick from a wrench. But David continued his performance, his voice growing more distressed with each word. "Rebecca, you know how you are when you're rushing to get to work. You probably didn't even notice the brakes feeling different this morning. Thank God you made it here safely. I can't believe I was so careless." David's friend Mike, who had given us a ride to the garage after my car had failed to stop at the intersection outside our neighborhood, shook his head sympathetically. "Don't beat yourself up too much, man. These things happen when you're trying to help. At least Rebecca's okay. Women don't really pay attention to how their cars feel anyway. She probably wouldn't have noticed if the brakes were completely gone." The two men shared a knowing look, the kind that said they understood the burden of dealing with wives who couldn't tell a brake pedal from a gas pedal. Mike continued, "My wife drove around for 3 months with a grinding noise before she mentioned it to me. Could have been a complete brake failure. Lucky thing Rebecca has you looking out for her." I stood there, nodding along with their narrative, playing the role they expected me to inhabit. The grateful, slightly scattered wife who needed her husband's mechanical expertise to keep her safe on the road. The woman who was so focused on her little part-time job that she couldn't be trusted to notice when her own vehicle was trying to kill her. But inside, behind the mask of concerned compliance, something entirely different was calculating. David thought he knew everything about me, thought he had mapped out every corner of my capabilities and limitations. He believed the story I'd been telling for 4 years, the carefully constructed persona I'd built to test the man I'd fallen in love with. Let them think I'm helpless. Let them believe I'm the naive suburban housewife who trusts her husband's explanations without question. They have absolutely no idea who they're really dealing with, or what I'm truly capable of discovering. My name is Rebecca Martinez Thompson, and while my husband believes I work part-time doing basic bookkeeping for small local businesses, the reality is far more complex. For the past 12 years, I've built a reputation as one of the most skilled forensic accountants in the Pacific Northwest, specializing in insurance fraud investigations that involve staged accidents and deliberate property damage. I've worked with federal agencies, major insurance companies, and law enforcement departments across 4 states, tracking down elaborate schemes where people fake their own deaths, stage car accidents, and manipulate financial records to collect massive payouts. The irony of my current situation wasn't lost on me. The man who had just attempted to orchestrate my death had no idea his wife was an expert at unraveling exactly these types of carefully planned accidents. Every day, I sit in courtrooms and present evidence that sends people to prison for decades. I've testified in cases where spouses have tried to murder their partners for insurance money, where business owners have burned down their own buildings, where families have faked kidnappings and staged elaborate disappearances. I've seen every variation of human greed and deception, every method people use to make murder look like misfortune. And now, standing in this garage listening to my husband explain how he accidentally severed my brake lines, I was watching my own case unfold in real time. When I first met David Thompson 3.5 years ago at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle, he seemed like everything a woman could want in a partner. Tall, confident, successful in commercial real estate, with the kind of easy charm that made conversations flow effortlessly. He had stories about closing million-dollar deals, about his expanding business, about the bright future he was building. I was between major cases at the time, having just finished a 6-month investigation that had resulted in the arrest of an entire family who had been staging slip-and-fall accidents across 3 states. I was emotionally drained from spending months immersed in the darkness of human manipulation, and David represented something different, something normal and stable and refreshingly uncomplicated. But I made a decision that would define our entire relationship from that first conversation. I chose not to reveal the full scope of my professional life. When David asked what I did for work, I said I helped small businesses with their books, that I balanced accounts and managed payroll. For local shops and restaurants, I made it sound modest, routine, forgettable. This wasn't entirely a lie. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I did maintain a small bookkeeping service as a cover for my real work, handling the financial records for a handful of legitimate small businesses. It provided the perfect explanation for my irregular schedule, my frequent travel, and the need for me to spend long hours analyzing financial documents. But I let David believe this was the entirety of my professional identity. I wanted to see who he really was when he didn't feel intimidated or impressed by my actual career. I wanted to know if he would respect me for who I was as a person, rather than being either threatened by my success or attracted to my professional status. For the first year of our relationship, this strategy seemed to work perfectly. David was supportive and encouraging about my little bookkeeping business. He would ask how my day went, listen to my carefully edited stories about helping restaurant owners organize their receipts, or small retail shops prepare for tax season. He seemed genuinely interested in my work, even if he clearly saw it as something modest and unchallenging. We moved in together after 18 months, and I carefully maintained the infrastructure of my double life. I rented a small office space in a strip mall that looked exactly like what you'd expect from a neighborhood bookkeeping service. Basic furniture, standard office equipment, a simple sign on the door that read, Martinez Financial Services, Bookkeeping and Tax Preparation. But the back room of that office was where my real work happened. Secure computers with encrypted hard drives, multiple phone lines, filing cabinets full of case documents that could send dozens of people to federal prison. I had surveillance equipment, financial analysis software, and direct communication links with law enforcement agencies across the country. David never asked to see my office. He never questioned why I sometimes received phone calls at odd hours, why I occasionally needed to travel on short notice, or why I seemed to know so much about complex financial regulations for someone who supposedly just balanced small business accounts. I drove a modest Toyota Camry, dressed in simple business casual clothing, and spoke about my work in the most mundane terms possible. When David's friends asked what I did, I would say things like just boring number stuff or helping people organize their receipts. They would nod politely and change the subject, exactly as I intended. Meanwhile, I was solving cases that involved millions of dollars in fraudulent claims, testifying before federal grand juries, and helping to dismantle criminal organizations. that had been operating for decades. But at home, I was just Rebecca, who spent her days making sure small businesses could pay their taxes on time. We got married in a small ceremony 8 months ago, and I thought I had found the balance I was looking for. David seemed content with our life, supportive of my work without being overly curious about its details, and committed to building a future together. But sometime in the past 6 months, I started noticing changes. Subtle at first, then increasingly obvious to someone trained to detect deception and manipulation. David's stories about his real estate deals began to contain inconsistencies. He had too much cash for someone whose business was supposedly struggling with the economic downturn. He made expensive purchases that didn't align with the financial picture he painted. When I would ask casual questions about his work, the way any spouse might, he would deflect or change the subject. He started talking about money in ways that made me professionally suspicious. References to big payouts coming soon and investments that were about to mature that didn't match anything he'd mentioned before. Then came the life insurance policies. 3 separate policies, all substantial, all taken out within the past 4 months. When I discovered them while organizing our financial documents for tax purposes, David explained them as just being responsible and making sure you're taken care of if something happens to me. But my professional instincts were screaming. The timing was wrong, the amounts were excessive, and the way David handled the paperwork felt familiar in all the worst ways. I'd seen this pattern before, in cases where spouses were planning to kill their partners for the insurance money. I started paying closer attention to our daily life, looking for the signs I'd learned to recognize in my professional work. David had been asking detailed questions about my schedule, my driving routes, my daily routines. He'd been unusually interested in my car maintenance, volunteering to handle oil changes and basic repairs that I'd always managed myself. 3 weeks ago, our garage door had malfunctioned, nearly falling on me as I tried to back out for work. David had been very concerned, very apologetic about not getting it fixed sooner. But when I examined the mechanism later, it looked like someone had deliberately weakened the support cables. 2 weeks ago, there had been a gas leak in our kitchen that our neighbor had smelled and reported. The gas company had found a loose connection that could have caused a dangerous buildup of fumes. David had thanked me for being so careful about ventilation, saying I probably saved our lives by opening windows that morning. But I hadn't opened any windows, and I'd noticed that David had been home alone for several hours before I returned from a client meeting. Now, standing in this garage listening to my husband explain how he'd accidentally cut my brake lines while trying to fix an oil leak he'd probably created himself, I realized I was looking at a sophisticated murder plot disguised as a series of unfortunate accidents. David wasn't just trying to kill me for insurance money. Based on the patterns I was seeing, he was building a narrative of mechanical failures and household accidents that would make my eventual death look like the tragic conclusion to a string of near misses. The grieving widower who had tried so hard to keep his wife safe, only to lose her to one final unavoidable accident. It was actually an impressive scheme, the kind that might have worked if he'd chosen a different target. But David had made one critical error in his planning. He'd decided to murder a woman whose entire career was built on exposing exactly these types of elaborate deceptions. Tommy was explaining the repair process, how he'd need to replace the entire brake line system to ensure my safety. David was nodding along, playing the concerned husband who would spare no expense to protect his wife. Mike was offering to drive us home and help coordinate getting the car back once it was fixed. I smiled and thanked them both, maintaining the persona of the grateful wife who was so lucky to have such caring men in her life. But inside, I was already planning my next moves. David thought he was hunting me, but he had no idea he'd just become the prey. As we walked toward Mike's truck, David's hand returned to my shoulder. This time, I understood the gesture differently. It wasn't a warning or a claim of ownership. It was the touch of a man who believed he was comforting a woman he planned to murder, completely unaware that she was already building the case that would send him to prison for the rest of his life. I settled into the passenger seat and buckled my seatbelt carefully, a small smile playing at the corners of my mouth. David had cut my brake lines by mistake, but everything I was about to do would be entirely on purpose. The ride home in Mike's truck was a masterclass in masculine solidarity. David sat in the front passenger seat, his voice heavy with what anyone listening would interpret as guilt and concern. Mike kept offering reassurance, telling David that accidents happen and that the important thing was that I was safe. "I just can't believe I was so careless," David said, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I'd seen him use dozens of times when he wanted to appear vulnerable. "Rebecca could have been killed because of my stupid mistake. What kind of husband doesn't double-check his work when it comes to his wife's safety?" Mike glanced at me in the rearview mirror before responding. "Hey man, don't torture yourself. You were trying to help by fixing that oil leak. These old cars have problems, and sometimes when you're working in tight spaces, things happen. Rebecca knows you'd never do anything to hurt her intentionally." I made the appropriate murmuring, sounds of agreement from the back seat, playing my role perfectly. The understanding wife who recognized that her husband's mechanical inexperience had nearly cost her life, but who bore no resentment because his intentions had been good. I even reached forward to squeeze David's shoulder, a gesture of forgiveness and continued trust. But while I was performing supportive spouse, my mind was racing through the implications of what I'd learned at the garage. The brake line cut was clean and deliberate, made with proper tools rather than accidentally nicked by a wrench. The location of the cut was strategically chosen to cause total brake failure at exactly the moment when I would need them most. During the morning commute, when I typically drove through several busy intersections, David had been studying my routines for months, learning the timing of my departures, the routes I took to my supposed bookkeeping clients. He knew that I always backed out of our driveway at exactly 7:45 each morning, that I stopped at the same coffee shop 3 blocks from our house, and that I had to navigate a particularly challenging intersection where 4 busy streets converged. If my brakes had failed at that intersection during morning rush hour, the result would have been catastrophic, not just for me, but potentially for other drivers and pedestrians. David's plan wasn't just about collecting insurance money. It was about creating a spectacular accident that would generate sympathy and eliminate any possibility of suspicion. The grieving widower, whose wife had died in a tragic car accident after he'd tried so hard to maintain her vehicle. The local news would probably run a story about how David had been working on the car just the day before, desperately trying to fix a minor oil leak, only to accidentally create the mechanical failure that killed his beloved wife. As we pulled into our driveway, I noticed David scanning our house with the practiced eye of someone conducting an assessment. Our 2-story colonial sat on a quiet street lined with similar homes, each with well-maintained lawns and the kind of suburban respectability that made tragic accidents seem all the more shocking when they occurred. David thanked Mike for the ride and assured him that we'd be fine getting my car back from the garage once the repairs were completed. Mike offered to help with anything we needed, the way neighbors do when someone has experienced a close call. After he drove away, David and I stood in our driveway for a moment, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. "I'm so sorry, Rebecca," David said, pulling me into what appeared to be a protective embrace. "I could have lost you today because of my carelessness. I promise I'll be more careful in the future. Maybe I should leave the car maintenance to the professionals." I pressed my face against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne while calculating how many federal laws he'd just violated. Attempted murder, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, destruction of property with intent to cause bodily harm. The list was substantial, and it was growing longer with each passing hour. "It's okay," I whispered against his shirt. "You were trying to help. I know you'd never hurt me intentionally." The word intentionally hung between us, and I felt David's arms tighten around me slightly. He was probably wondering if I suspected anything, if my choice of words carried any hidden meaning. But when I pulled back to look at him, I made sure my expression showed nothing but trust and affection. That evening, I made David's favorite dinner while he sat at our kitchen table, supposedly catching up on work emails but actually watching my every movement. I could feel his eyes tracking me as I moved between the stove and the counter, as I reached for dishes in the upper cabinets, as I bent to retrieve items from the lower drawers. He was studying me with the focus of someone planning their next move, and I realized that my survival of the brake line incident had probably accelerated his timeline. Whatever he'd been planning as his next step, my continued existence meant he needed to implement it sooner rather than later. "How are you feeling?" he asked when I set his plate in front of him. "Any delayed shock from this morning? Sometimes these things hit you hours later." I sat down across from him with my own plate, noting how his question seemed designed to assess my mental state rather than express genuine concern. "I'm okay. Just grateful that I made it to the garage safely. It's scary to think what could have happened if I'd been driving on the freeway instead of surface streets." David nodded thoughtfully. "You know, maybe we should look into getting you a newer car. Something with better safety features, more reliable. I've been doing well with some recent property deals, and I think we could afford a decent down payment." This was interesting. David was suggesting we take on a car payment when he'd been complaining about money being tight for months. Unless, of course, he was expecting a significant influx of cash in the near future. Like life insurance proceeds from a wife who wouldn't be around to help make the payments. "That's sweet of you to offer," I said, "but I really like my Honda. It's been reliable for years. Today was just a freak accident because of the work you were doing underneath it. Once Tommy fixes the brake lines, it should be good as new." I watched David's face carefully as I spoke, looking for the micro-expressions that might reveal his true thoughts. There was a flash of something across his features when I mentioned keeping the car, a brief tightening around his eyes that suggested my decision didn't align with his preferences. After dinner, David said he needed to make some work calls and disappeared into his home office. This was unusual because he typically handled business during regular hours and spent evenings watching television or reading. But tonight he closed the door and spoke in voices too low for me to hear clearly from the living room. I used this opportunity to begin my own evening routine, which involved activities David knew nothing about. While he made his mysterious phone calls, I accessed my secure laptop and began documenting everything that had happened since the brake line incident. My real office might be across town, but I'd equipped our home with everything I needed to conduct preliminary investigations. Hidden in our bedroom closet, behind winter clothes that wouldn't be disturbed for months, I had a small safe containing backup hard drives, encrypted communication devices, and emergency funds in multiple currencies. I photographed the clothes I'd worn to the garage, noting any potential transfer evidence. I documented the timeline of events, cross-referencing David's story with the physical evidence I'd observed. I began building the foundation of a case that would eventually become a federal prosecution for attempted murder and insurance fraud. But more immediately, I needed to determine what David's next move would be. The brake line sabotage had failed, which meant he would need to try something else, probably soon. Men like David didn't abandon their plans when the first attempt didn't work. They adapted, escalated, became more desperate and therefore more dangerous. I heard his office door open and quickly closed my laptop, switching to a home decorating website that would explain why I'd been staring at a screen. David appeared in the living room doorway, his expression unreadable. "Everything okay with work?" I asked, looking up from what appeared to be a page about kitchen renovation ideas. "Just some complications with a commercial property deal," he said. "Nothing I can't handle, but it might require some travel in the next few weeks. I may need to fly to Portland or Sacramento to meet with investors." This was the first I'd heard about any travel requirements for David's work. In the 3.5 years I'd known him, his real estate business had been entirely local. Sudden travel needs, especially to cities where he had no established business connections, suggested he was building alibis for future activities. "That sounds stressful," I said. "Are these new clients, or people you've worked with before?" David's hesitation was barely perceptible, but I caught it. "Mix of both. The market's changing, and I need to expand my network to stay competitive." I nodded understandingly while mentally noting another inconsistency in his story. David's explanations were becoming increasingly elaborate, requiring him to remember more details and maintain more complex deceptions. This was good news for me, because elaborate lies were easier to disprove than simple ones. Over the next few days, I maintained my normal routine while secretly documenting every anomaly in David's behavior. He'd started asking more detailed questions about my work schedule, wanting to know exactly when I'd be at which client locations and how long each appointment would take. He'd also become unusually interested in our household maintenance, volunteering to handle tasks that I'd always managed myself. He offered to check the water heater, inspect our electrical panel, and examine the tree branches that hung over our house for safety reasons. Each of these offers represented a potential opportunity for David to create another accident. A gas leak from a faulty water heater, an electrical fire from damaged wiring, or a conveniently falling tree branch. During a windstorm, I politely declined his help, explaining that I'd already scheduled professional inspections, but I made note of every suggestion. Meanwhile, I was conducting my own investigation into David's background, using resources and databases that my supposed bookkeeping business wouldn't normally access. What I discovered painted a picture that was far more disturbing than I'd initially realized. David Thompson wasn't just planning to kill me for insurance money. He was a man with a pattern of financial deception that stretched back years before we'd ever met. His real estate business was built on a foundation of fraudulent transactions, inflated property values, and investors who existed only on paper. He owed substantial money to people who weren't content to wait for traditional legal remedies. The kind of people who expected their loans to be repaid on schedule, regardless of market conditions or personal circumstances. David needed a large influx of cash quickly, and my death would provide exactly that. But the more I learned about his financial situation, the more I realized that killing me was only part of his plan. David had been systematically stealing from his business partners, using his charm and apparent success to convince them to invest in properties that either didn't exist or were worth far less than he claimed. My death would not only provide him with life insurance proceeds, but it would also generate sympathy that might buy him time with his creditors. The grieving widower who'd lost everything when his wife died tragically, who needed just a little more time to get back on his feet before repaying what he owed. It was actually a sophisticated scheme, the kind that demonstrated intelligence and long-term planning. Under different circumstances, I might have been impressed by the complexity of David's deception. But since I was his intended victim, I was more focused on documenting every detail that would help prosecutors put him away for the rest of his life. A week after the brake line incident, David announced that he'd been invited to a real estate conference in Portland and would need to travel the following weekend. This would be the first time he'd left me alone overnight since we'd been married, and the timing felt significant. "I hate to leave you right after what happened with your car," he said over breakfast, his voice full of reluctant duty, "but this conference could lead to some important business connections. We really need the income, especially with the car repair bills." I assured him that I'd be fine alone for a few days, that I understood the importance of his business development. Privately, I was calculating how David's absence might factor into his overall plan. Was he establishing an alibi for when my next accident occurred? Or was he planning to arrange something that would happen while he was conveniently out of town? Either way, his trip to Portland would give me the opportunity to conduct a thorough search of our house without worrying about discovery. I suspected David had been hiding evidence of his planning somewhere in our home, and I was determined to find it before he had the chance to use it against me. The morning David left for Portland, I kissed him goodbye at our front door, and waved as he drove away in his silver BMW. As soon as his car disappeared around the corner, I began the most comprehensive search of my own home that I'd ever conducted. I started with David's office, carefully photographing everything before I moved it so I could restore the room to its original condition. Hidden behind a row of real estate reference books, I found a folder containing newspaper clippings about car accidents involving brake failure, house fires caused by faulty electrical wiring, and tragic accidents where spouses had died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Each clipping was annotated in David's handwriting, with notes about the investigation process, the insurance payouts, and the legal outcomes for the surviving family members. It was like finding a handbook for spousal murder disguised as a collection of current events. In his desk drawer, underneath a stack of legitimate business documents, I discovered a life insurance policy I'd never seen before. A fourth policy, this one with a death benefit substantially larger than the 3 I already knew about. This policy had been purchased just 2 months ago, and according to the documentation, I had supposedly applied for it myself. My signature on the application was a nearly perfect forgery, close enough to pass casual inspection, but different enough that a handwriting expert would easily identify it as fake. David had been practicing my signature, probably using documents from ARDA, joint bank accounts and mortgage paperwork as reference. But the most disturbing discovery was in our bedroom, hidden in the back of David's closet behind winter coats that wouldn't be needed for months. A small cardboard box containing items that made my blood run cold: brake fluid, electrical wire strippers, a small bottle of colorless liquid that I suspected was antifreeze, which was odorless and tasteless, but deadly if consumed in sufficient quantities. Tools for creating accidents that would appear completely natural until someone who knew what to look for examined the evidence. I photographed everything carefully, documenting the exact location where each item had been hidden. This was evidence that would be crucial in proving premeditation and planning, rather than crimes of opportunity or passion. But as I restored David's closet to its original appearance, I realized that finding this evidence had changed my situation in fundamental ways. David wasn't just planning to kill me eventually. Based on what I'd discovered, he was planning to kill me soon, probably within the next few weeks. His trip to Portland wasn't about establishing an alibi. It was about finalizing the details of my murder with people who specialized in making deaths look accidental. David was out of town meeting with professionals who could help him execute a plan that would be far more sophisticated than anything he could manage on his own. I had maybe days to build a case strong enough to stop him, or I was going to become another tragic news story about a woman who died in an unfortunate accident while her husband was conveniently out of town. The next morning, I sat in my real office for the first time in weeks, surrounded by the tools of my actual profession, rather than the carefully constructed facade I maintained at home. The contrast was jarring. While David believed I spent my days in a modest strip mall office, balancing restaurant receipts, I was actually seated in a secure facility that looked more like a law enforcement command center than a traditional accounting firm. My office occupied the top floor of a downtown Seattle building, accessible only through a private elevator that required both a key card and biometric scanner. The windows were tinted to prevent surveillance from neighboring buildings, and the entire space was equipped with technology that would detect any electronic eavesdropping attempts. I'd built this operation over 12 years, establishing relationships with federal agencies, insurance companies, and law enforcement departments. That allowed me to pursue cases that regular accountants would never encounter. My client list included the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, the Department of Justice's Asset Forfeiture Unit, and insurance companies that handled claims worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me as I spread David's evidence across my conference table. I'd spent my career helping other people expose the exact type of scheme that my own husband was attempting to perpetrate against me. The fake accidents, the forged documents, the careful construction of alibis and innocent explanations. I'd seen it all before, but never from the perspective of the intended victim. My assistant, Maria Santos, knocked on my office door carrying a thick folder of documents. Maria had been with me for 8 years, and she was one of only 3 people who knew the full extent of my professional activities. She'd helped me maintain the fiction of my modest bookkeeping business, fielding calls and managing appointments that supported my cover story. "I have the background report you requested," Maria said, closing the door behind her and activating the white noise generator that would prevent anyone from overhearing our conversation. David Thompson's financial history is more complicated than we initially thought. She spread the documents across my desk, revealing a pattern of deception that stretched back more than a decade. David's real estate business was built on a foundation of lies so elaborate that it had taken my team of investigators 3 days to unravel the basic structure. "His current business license is legitimate," Maria continued, "but the properties he claims to manage either don't exist or are owned by shell companies that trace back to offshore accounts. He's been running a Ponzi scheme, using money from new investors to pay returns to earlier investors while skimming substantial amounts for personal use." The documentation showed that David owed nearly $2 million to various creditors, some of whom were legitimate financial institutions, but others who operated outside traditional legal frameworks, the kind of people who didn't file lawsuits when their loans weren't repaid on schedule. "There's more," Maria said, pulling out a series of photographs. "We tracked his movements over the past 6 months and found some interesting patterns. He's been meeting regularly with a man named Vincent Corelli, who has connections to organized crime families in both Seattle and Portland." The photographs showed David and Corelli sitting together in expensive restaurants, walking through empty parking lots, and shaking hands outside buildings that my research indicated were fronts for money laundering operations. These weren't casual social meetings. They were business transactions between people who understood that certain debts had to be paid regardless of personal circumstances. "Corelli specializes in what the FBI calls accident coordination," Maria explained. "He arranges situations where inconvenient people die in ways that appear completely natural. Car crashes, house fires, workplace accidents. His success rate is impressive because he never leaves evidence that points to deliberate planning." I studied the photographs more carefully, noting the body language between David and Corelli. These men weren't just discussing business opportunities. They were planning something specific, something that required careful coordination and precise timing. "Based on the surveillance we conducted while David was in Portland," Maria continued, "he met with Corelli twice and visited a warehouse that we believe is used for storing specialized equipment. Our contact at the Portland Police Department ran the address through their database and found that it's registered to a company that officially provides movie props, but unofficially supplies items for various criminal activities." The implications were clear. David's trip to Portland hadn't been about real estate conferences or business development. He'd been finalizing the details of my murder with professionals who had experience making deaths appear accidental. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" I asked. Based on Corelli's previous operations, he typically implements his plans within 2 to 3 weeks of the final planning meeting. David returned from Portland yesterday, which means you probably have less than 2 weeks before they make their move. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. 2 weeks to build a case that would not only protect me, but also ensure that David and his accomplices spent the rest of their lives in federal prison. 2 weeks to gather evidence that would satisfy prosecutors while staying alive long enough to present it. "There's something else you need to know," Maria said, her voice dropping even lower. "We intercepted some communications between David and his insurance contacts. He's been asking questions about claim processing times and payout procedures. Specifically, he wanted to know how quickly life insurance proceeds are typically released to beneficiaries after accidental deaths. This information confirmed what I'd already suspected. David wasn't just planning to kill me. He was planning to collect the insurance money as quickly as possible and disappear before anyone could conduct a thorough investigation into his business dealings. "I need you to coordinate with Detective Rodriguez," I told Maria. "She's handled several cases involving Corelli's organization, and she'll know how to approach this without alerting them to our investigation. But we need to be careful. If David suspects that I know anything, he might accelerate his timeline." Maria nodded and began collecting the documents. "What about your cover story? David will expect you to maintain your normal routine, but staying home alone with him seems incredibly dangerous." She was right. I couldn't continue pretending to be the naive bookkeeper wife while living in the same house as a man who was actively planning my murder. But I also couldn't suddenly change my behavior in ways that might alert David to my knowledge of his plans. "I'm going to tell him that the brake line incident has made me nervous about driving alone," I said. "I'll suggest that we spend more time together until I feel comfortable behind the wheel again. That way, I can monitor his activities while making it harder for him to implement whatever plan he's developed." It was a risky strategy, but it was better than giving David opportunities to stage accidents while I was supposedly at client meetings across town. If I could keep him under observation, I might be able to identify exactly when and how he planned to kill me. That evening, I returned home to find David in an unusually good mood. He'd prepared dinner and opened a bottle of wine, creating an atmosphere of celebration that felt deeply unsettling, given what I now knew about his recent activities. "How was your trip?" I asked, accepting a glass of wine while mentally calculating how much I could safely drink without impairing my judgment. "Very productive," David said, his smile a little too bright. "I made some important connections that should help expand the business significantly. In fact, I'm optimistic that our financial situation is going to improve dramatically in the next few weeks." The phrasing was telling. David wasn't talking about gradual business growth or long-term success. He was expecting a sudden, significant improvement in our finances, the kind of improvement that would come from a large insurance payout. "That's wonderful," I said, raising my glass in a toast. "I'm proud of how hard you've been working to build your business." We clinked glasses, and I watched David's face carefully as he drank. There was something different about his expression, a confidence that hadn't been there before his trip to Portland. He looked like a man who had solved a difficult problem and was satisfied with his solution. Over dinner, David was more talkative than he'd been in months. He told elaborate stories about the real estate conference he'd supposedly attended, describing presentations about market trends and networking opportunities with investors from other cities. His stories were detailed and plausible, the kind of lies that would convince anyone who wasn't specifically looking for deception. But I was trained to listen for inconsistencies, and David's stories contained several. He mentioned attending presentations by speakers who hadn't been scheduled for any real estate conferences in Portland that weekend. He described visiting properties that didn't exist at the addresses he provided. He referenced conversations with investors whose companies weren't registered in any of the databases my team had checked. "You seem energized by the trip," I observed. "It must have been exactly what you needed to refocus your business strategy." "It really was," David agreed. "Sometimes you need to step outside your comfort zone to see new possibilities. I met people who think differently about problem solving, who aren't limited by conventional approaches." This was probably the most honest thing David had said all evening. He had indeed met people who thought differently about problem solving, specifically, people who solved problems by eliminating them permanently. After dinner, David suggested we watch a movie together, something we hadn't done in weeks. He seemed intent on spending the evening together, and I wondered if this was part of his planning process. Was he trying to create memories of our final happy evening together, or was he simply monitoring my behavior to ensure I wasn't suspicious of his activities? We settled on the couch to watch a romantic comedy from the early 2000s, something light and familiar that wouldn't require much attention. But while David seemed to be enjoying the movie, I was hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every change in his breathing pattern. Halfway through the film, David's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it briefly, and I caught a glimpse of the sender's name, Vincent. The message was short, just a few words, but David's reaction suggested it was significant. His posture straightened, and he typed a quick response before setting the phone aside. "Work?" I asked casually. "Just a follow-up from someone I met. In Portland," David said. "Nothing urgent." But the timing of the message felt important. Vincent Corelli was contacting David on a Sunday evening, just days after their meeting in Portland. This wasn't routine business communication. It was coordination between people who were implementing a time-sensitive plan. The next morning, David announced that he needed to spend the day at his office catching up on work that had accumulated while he was traveling. This was unusual because David typically worked from home on Mondays, using the day to make phone calls and handle administrative tasks. "I hate to leave you alone so soon after the car incident," he said, his voice heavy with fake concern. "Are you sure you'll be okay by yourself?" I assured him that I'd be fine, that I planned to spend the day organizing our household files and maybe doing some cooking. David seemed satisfied with this explanation, kissing me goodbye before leaving. In his BMW. As soon as he was gone, I called Maria to arrange emergency surveillance. If David was meeting with Corelli or his associates today, I needed to know exactly what they were planning. But more importantly, I needed to confirm whether they were conducting final preparations for my murder. Within an hour, my surveillance team had eyes on David's supposed office location. What they discovered was that David hadn't gone to his office at all. Instead, he'd driven to a storage facility on the outskirts of Seattle, where he met with two men who my team immediately identified as Vincent Corelli and an associate known for specializing in vehicular accidents. The three men spent nearly 2 hours at the storage facility, loading items into David's car that were too small for my surveillance team to identify from their distant vantage point. But based on the care with which the items were handled and the serious expressions on all three faces, these weren't routine business supplies. When David returned home that evening, he seemed nervous for the first time since I'd known him. He checked and rechecked the locks on our doors, peered out the windows several times, and startled when our neighbor's dog barked in the backyard. "Everything okay?" I asked, noting how his hands shook slightly as he poured himself a drink. "Just tired from a long day," he said, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. "I might turn in early tonight." David had never been an early sleeper. He was the kind of person who stayed up late watching television or reading business magazines. His sudden desire to go to bed early suggested that he had activities planned for later in the evening, activities that he didn't want me to witness. I waited until I heard his breathing settle into the rhythm of sleep before quietly leaving our bedroom. Moving through our house with the stealth I'd learned during surveillance training, I made my way to the garage where David had parked his car. Using a small flashlight and the lockpicking skills I'd acquired during my years working with law enforcement, I carefully examined David's BMW. What I found confirmed my worst fears about the timeline of his plan. Hidden in the spare tire compartment were items that could only be used for one purpose, creating accidents that would appear completely natural. A small device that could be attached to a car's gas line to cause an explosion during normal driving. Chemicals that could be introduced into a home's water supply to cause apparent food poisoning that would actually be fatal within hours. But most disturbing was a small electronic device that looked like a garage door opener, but was actually designed to interfere with a car's electronic systems. When activated, it would cause brake failure, steering problems, or engine malfunction. That would appear to be random mechanical failures. David wasn't just planning one accident. He was prepared to create multiple opportunities for my death, using whichever method presented the best chance of success while maintaining his appearance of innocence. I photographed everything carefully, documenting not just the items themselves, but their exact placement in David's car. This evidence would be crucial in proving premeditation and conspiracy, but it also told me something else. David was planning to implement his scheme within the next few days. The devices I'd found weren't the kind of items that could be stored safely for extended periods. They were meant to be used quickly after acquisition, before their electronic components degraded or their chemical components became unstable. As I carefully restored everything to its original position and returned to our bedroom, I realized that my investigation had reached a critical point. I had enough evidence to prove David's intent to commit murder, but I needed to catch him in the act of implementing his plan to ensure that prosecutors could pursue the most serious charges. More importantly, I needed to protect myself while gathering that final piece of evidence. David had crossed the line from planning to active preparation. Within days, possibly hours, he would attempt to kill me using methods that had been successful in previous cases handled by Vincent Corelli's organization. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Maria called while David was in the shower, her voice tight with urgency. "Vincent Corelli was arrested last night on unrelated charges," she said. "Federal agents raided his warehouse and found evidence connecting him to 3 unsolved murders in the past 2 years. He's being held without bail." This development would force David to either abandon his plan or implement it using resources he'd already acquired. Given the timeline pressure from his creditors and the evidence I'd found in his car, I suspected he would choose the latter option. "David doesn't know about Corelli's arrest yet," Maria continued. "Our contacts at the FBI are keeping the news quiet for another 24 hours to see if any of Corelli's associates make contact or try to retrieve evidence." This gave me a narrow window of opportunity. If I could document David's reaction to learning about Corelli's arrest, it would provide additional evidence of their criminal relationship. But it would also likely trigger David to accelerate his timeline and attempt to kill me before law enforcement could connect him to Corelli's organization. As David emerged from the bathroom, I made a decision that would determine whether I survived the next few days. Instead of continuing to play the role of the innocent wife, I was going to take control of the situation and force David to reveal his true intentions. It was time to stop being the prey and start being the hunter. The morning I decided to confront David dawned gray and overcast, with the kind of Seattle drizzle that made everything feel muted and uncertain. I stood at our kitchen window, watching him through the reflection in the glass as he sat at the breakfast table scrolling through news headlines on his phone. His face was a mask of casual concentration, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened whenever he read something that caught his attention. He hadn't found the story about Vincent Corelli's arrest yet, but he would soon. The FBI had released the information to select media outlets an hour ago, and it would be spreading across news websites and social media platforms throughout the morning. When David discovered that his partner in murder had been taken into federal custody, his carefully constructed timeline would collapse. I poured myself a cup of coffee and joined him at the table, noting how he immediately angled his phone away from me. For months, I'd been documenting these small gestures of secrecy, building a profile of a man who was hiding far more than he realized I could see. "Anything interesting in the news?" I asked, stirring cream into my coffee with deliberate casualness. "Just the usual business stories," David replied, but his thumb moved quickly across the screen, closing whatever he'd been reading. "Market fluctuations, property values, nothing that would interest you." I smiled at the condescension in his voice, the assumption that I wouldn't understand or care about complex financial matters. If only he knew that I'd spent the previous evening reviewing federal indictments against organized crime figures who specialized in exactly the kind of services he'd been purchasing. "I've been thinking about what you said the other night," I said, watching his face carefully. "About expanding your business connections and trying new approaches to problem solving. It sounds like you've found some innovative strategies." David's hand stilled on his phone for just a moment, but it was enough to confirm that my words had hit their target. He was wondering how much I knew, whether my comment was innocent conversation or something more pointed. Innovation is important. In any business, he said slowly. Sometimes you have to be willing to think outside conventional boundaries to achieve your goals. The irony of his statement wasn't lost on me. David was certainly thinking outside conventional boundaries, but his innovative problem-solving involved murder and insurance fraud rather than legitimate business development. My phone buzzed with a text message from Maria, a single word that I'd been expecting. Now. The FBI had just released news of Corelli's arrest to major news outlets, and within minutes, every news website and social media platform would be carrying the story. I excused myself to use the bathroom, giving David privacy to discover the news that would change everything. From the hallway, I could hear the soft sounds of his phone as he continued scrolling through headlines, followed by a sharp intake of breath that told me he'd found what I was waiting for him to find. When I returned to the kitchen, David's entire demeanor had shifted. His casual morning routine had been replaced by barely controlled anxiety. His phone lay face down on the table, and his hands were clenched into fists that he was trying to disguise by wrapping them around his coffee mug. "Everything okay?" I asked, settling back into my chair. "You look like you've seen something upsetting." "Just some disappointing business news," David said, but his voice was tight with stress. "A potential partner has run into some legal trouble that might affect our deal." This was the closest David had ever come to telling me the truth about his criminal activities. The potential partner was Vincent Corelli, and the legal trouble was a federal arrest on multiple charges of conspiracy to commit murder. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. "Is it the kind of problem that might resolve itself, or something that will require you to find alternative approaches?" David's eyes met mine for a moment, and I saw something flicker across his face. Suspicion, perhaps, or recognition that my questions were more perceptive than he'd expected from someone he considered intellectually inferior. "Alternative approaches," he said finally. "Sometimes when one door closes, you have to find another way to reach your destination." The conversation felt like a chess match where both players were moving pieces while pretending not to understand the rules. David was trying to determine how much I knew while maintaining his cover story. I was gathering intelligence about his state of mind and his likely next moves while appearing to be nothing more than a concerned wife. "Well, I'm sure you'll figure something out," I said, standing to clear our breakfast dishes. "You've always been resourceful when it comes to solving problems." As I moved around the kitchen, I could feel David watching me with an intensity that hadn't been there before. Corelli's arrest had forced him to reevaluate his situation, and part of that reevaluation involved assessing whether I posed any kind of threat to his plans. The rest of the morning passed in a strange dance of normalcy punctuated by moments of barely concealed tension. David made phone calls in his office with the door closed, speaking in voices too low for me to hear clearly. I maintained my routine of household tasks while positioning myself to observe his behavior and document any changes in his patterns. Around noon, David announced that he needed to run errands and would be gone for several hours. This was unusual because he typically handled business matters from home on weekdays, leaving the house only for scheduled meetings or appointments. "I need to pick up some supplies for a project I'm working on," he explained, avoiding eye contact as he gathered his keys and wallet. "Might stop by the hardware store, maybe the electronics shop downtown." The mention of hardware and electronics stores sent a chill through me. Based on the equipment I'd found in his car, David already had everything he needed to create fatal accidents. If he was shopping for additional supplies, it meant he was adapting his plan to work without Corelli's professional support. "Drive safely," I said, kissing his cheek in a gesture that probably looked affectionate to anyone watching, but felt like a goodbye. "I'll be here when you get back." As soon as David's car disappeared down our street, I activated the emergency protocol I'd established with my team. Within minutes, surveillance units were tracking David's movements while technical specialists prepared to document whatever evidence he was about to create. But more importantly, I began implementing the final phase of my own plan. For months, I'd been gathering evidence of David's criminal activities while maintaining the facade of ignorance. Now it was time to force him into making choices that would reveal his true intentions and provide the proof needed to ensure his conviction. I started by making phone calls that David would be able to trace if he chose to investigate. Calls to insurance companies asking about policy details and claim procedures. Calls to attorneys specializing in estate planning and asset protection. Calls that would create a digital trail suggesting I was suddenly concerned about my own mortality and taking steps to protect my interests. Then I began leaving physical evidence that would be impossible for David to miss. Documents about life insurance policies spread across our kitchen table. Handwritten notes about updating my will and changing beneficiary designations. A business card from a private investigator with a note suggesting I was planning to hire professional security services. Each piece of evidence was designed to convince David that I was becoming suspicious of his activities and taking action to protect myself. The goal was to force him to move quickly before he could develop a new plan that might be harder to detect and prevent. The psychology was simple. David needed me dead to solve his financial problems, but he also needed my death to appear accidental, to avoid investigation. If he believed I was becoming aware of the danger I was in, he would have to choose between abandoning his plan entirely or implementing it immediately using whatever resources he had available. Given the pressure from his creditors and the timeline established by his meetings with Corelli, I was betting that David would choose immediate action. And when he did, I would be ready with evidence, witnesses, and law enforcement backup that would ensure his arrest and conviction. By mid-afternoon, my surveillance team reported that David had visited 3 different stores, purchasing items that could be used to create explosive devices, disable vehicle safety systems, or contaminate food and water supplies. He wasn't just preparing one backup plan. He was preparing multiple options, giving himself the flexibility to adapt to whatever opportunities presented themselves. When David returned home that evening, he seemed calmer than he'd been in the morning. The anxiety and stress that had marked his behavior after discovering Corelli's arrest had been replaced by a focused determination that was even more unsettling. "How were your errands?" I asked as he set several shopping bags on our kitchen counter. "Productive," David replied, deliberately blocking my view of the bag contents. "I found everything I needed to complete my project." He began unpacking the bags with careful precision, removing items that appeared innocuous, but that I recognized from my years of investigating insurance fraud cases. Electronics components that could be assembled into remote detonation devices, chemicals that were legal to purchase individually but deadly when combined, tools that had legitimate household uses but could also be used to sabotage mechanical systems. "Looks like quite an ambitious project," I observed, noting how David organized each item with the methodical approach of someone following a detailed plan. "It's something I've been thinking about for a while," David said. "But I realized that if I'm going to do it right, I need to handle it myself rather than relying on outside help." This was as close as David would ever come to admitting that he was planning my murder. The project he was referring to was my death, and his comment about handling it himself was a reference to implementing his plan without Corelli's professional assistance. That night, I lay in bed listening to David's breathing, knowing that this would probably be the last time I would ever share a room with the man I'd married. Tomorrow, he would attempt to kill me using methods that had been successful in previous cases handled by Corelli's organization. But unlike Corelli's previous victims, I knew exactly what was coming. I'd spent weeks documenting David's preparations, building a case that would satisfy federal prosecutors and ensure conviction on charges that would keep him in prison for the rest of his life. But more immediately, I'd coordinated with law enforcement agencies to ensure that when David made his move, every moment would be recorded and every crime would be witnessed by professionals who could testify in court. The next morning brought the confrontation I'd been preparing for since the day I discovered my severed brake lines. David woke early and began what appeared to be his normal routine, but I could see the subtle differences that indicated today was different from every other day of our marriage. He dressed more carefully than usual, choosing clothes that would be appropriate for someone who was about to become a grieving widower. He spent extra time reviewing documents in his office, probably making final preparations for claiming insurance proceeds and managing the legal complications that would follow my death. Most tellingly, he prepared breakfast for both of us, something he rarely did, and watched carefully as I ate. I suspected that this would be David's first attempt to kill me, using chemicals he'd introduced into my food that would cause what appeared to be a sudden medical emergency. But I'd anticipated this possibility and had been substituting identical-looking food that I'd prepared myself, using sleight-of-hand techniques I'd learned during undercover operations. David was watching me consume what he believed was poisoned food, waiting for symptoms that would never appear because I wasn't actually eating anything he'd prepared. "You seem thoughtful this morning," I said, noting how intently David was observing my reactions. "Is there something special about today?" "Just looking forward to seeing how some recent projects develop," David replied, his voice carrying an undertone of anticipation that was deeply unsettling. When the expected symptoms didn't appear after breakfast, I could see David's confidence wavering slightly. His first plan had failed, which meant he would need to implement one of his backup strategies, but each failure would make him more desperate and potentially more dangerous. Around 10 o'clock, David suggested that we take a drive together to look at some properties he was considering for investment. This was clearly his second attempt, probably involving the electronic device I'd seen in his car that could cause mechanical failures during normal driving. "That sounds lovely," I agreed, knowing that law enforcement surveillance teams were already positioned along every route we might take. "I'd enjoy seeing what kinds of opportunities you're evaluating." As we walked toward David's BMW, I activated a small recording device that would document everything that happened during our drive. But more importantly, I activated a GPS tracker that would allow my surveillance team to follow our exact route and position themselves to intervene if David's plan showed signs of succeeding. David seemed nervous as he started the car, checking his mirrors more frequently than usual and taking several deep breaths before pulling out of our driveway. He was about to attempt murder using a method that he'd never personally tested, and his anxiety was understandable. We drove through our neighborhood toward the commercial district where David claimed the investment properties were located. But instead of heading toward legitimate real estate opportunities, David was driving toward an isolated area where a vehicle accident would be less likely to involve innocent bystanders. "The properties are in an interesting location," I commented as we turned onto increasingly rural roads. "Very private and secluded." "Privacy can be valuable in real estate," David replied, but his hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly enough that his knuckles had turned white. When we reached a stretch of road with steep embankments on both sides, David pulled over to what he claimed was the first property location. But there were no buildings visible, no signs of development, nothing that would indicate legitimate real estate opportunities. "I don't see any structures," I said, looking around at the empty landscape. "Are these raw land investments?" "Something like that," David said, reaching into the console between our seats where I knew he'd hidden the electronic device designed to disable our car's safety systems. This was the moment I'd been preparing for since the morning I discovered my severed brake lines. David was about to reveal his true intentions, attempting to murder me in a location where my death would appear to be the result of a tragic car accident. But as his hand closed around the device that would supposedly kill me, I reached into my purse and pulled out my forensic accountant credentials and federal law enforcement badge. "Hello, David," I said calmly, watching his face as he processed what he was seeing. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your recent business activities." The shock on David's face was worth every month of pretending to be someone I wasn't. His mouth opened and closed without sound, his eyes moving between my badge and my face as if he couldn't reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought. He knew about me. "Rebecca, what is this?" he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is who I really am," I replied, pulling out a thick folder of documents and photographs. "Rebecca Martinez Thompson, forensic accountant, specializing in insurance fraud investigations. And you, David, have just become my most important case." I spread the evidence across the dashboard between us, showing David photographs of his meetings with Vincent Corelli, documentation of his fraudulent real estate dealings, and detailed records of every step he'd taken in planning my murder. "For the past 8 months, I've been investigating your criminal activities," I continued, watching David's face cycle through shock, disbelief, and growing fear. "Every conversation we've had, every lie you've told, every piece of equipment you've purchased to kill me, it's all been documented and reported to federal law enforcement agencies." David's hand was still frozen on the electronic device, but now he seemed afraid to move it. He was beginning to understand that everything he thought he knew about our relationship had been carefully constructed deception. "You can't do this," he said, his voice gaining strength as anger replaced shock. "I'm your husband. We're married. You can't just spy on me like I'm some kind of criminal." "You are a criminal, David," I said, pulling out my phone to show him. Recorded conversations between him and Corelli. Conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, operating a Ponzi scheme, and about a dozen other federal charges that will keep you in prison for the rest of your life. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted our conversation. Multiple cars were pulling up behind us, their occupants emerging with the coordinated precision of law enforcement professionals. Detective Lisa Rodriguez led the team, accompanied by federal agents and insurance investigators who had been working on related cases involving Corelli's organization. "David Thompson," Detective Rodriguez called out as she approached our car. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and violation of federal racketeering statutes." David's face went through a final transformation as he realized that his carefully planned murder scheme had become his own conviction. The confident, charming man who had spent months manipulating me and planning my death was replaced by someone who looked smaller, older, and utterly defeated. As federal agents led David away in handcuffs, he turned back to look at me one final time. "How long have you known?" he asked. "I've suspected since you started taking out life insurance policies," I replied. "But I've known for certain since the morning you cut my brake lines and thought I was stupid enough to believe it was an accident." The arrest process took most of the afternoon, with agents cataloging evidence from David's car, our house, and the storage facility where he'd met with Corelli. The breadth of the conspiracy was impressive, involving not just my attempted murder, but a network of fraudulent activities that had been operating for years. Detective Rodriguez found me sitting in a coffee shop near the courthouse several hours, later reviewing final documentation for the prosecution team. "How are you holding up?" she asked, sliding into the booth across from me. "Better than I expected," I said honestly. "It's strange to realize that the man I married was planning to kill me, but it's also satisfying to know that we gathered enough evidence to ensure he'll never have the opportunity to hurt anyone else." The trial took place 6 months later, drawing national media attention because of the complexity of the scheme and the unusual circumstances of my undercover investigation. David was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Vincent Corelli, facing his own trial for multiple murders, provided testimony that helped prosecutors understand the full scope of David's planning. According to Corelli, David had been one of his most methodical clients, spending months developing contingency plans and backup strategies to ensure my death would appear completely accidental. The insurance companies involved in the case awarded me a substantial settlement for their role in enabling David's scheme, money that I used to establish a foundation providing support for other victims of domestic violence and financial fraud. But the most satisfying outcome was returning to my real work with a new appreciation for the complexity of human deception and the importance of trusting professional instincts even when they conflict with personal emotions. I'm Rebecca Martinez. Thompson and I learned that sometimes the greatest strength comes from letting people underestimate you right up until the moment you prove them devastatingly wrong. David thought he was married to a helpless bookkeeper who could be manipulated and murdered without consequence. Instead, he married a federal forensic accountant who specialized in exactly the kind of crimes he was planning to commit. He cut my brake lines by mistake, so I cut up his life, his freedom, and his future on purpose. And unlike his plan, mine worked perfectly. The courthouse steps felt different under my feet as I walked down them for the last time, knowing that David would never again see the world beyond prison walls. The media circus that had surrounded the trial was finally winding down, reporters packing up their equipment and moving on to the next sensational story. But for me, this moment represented something far more profound than the end of a high-profile criminal case. 6 months had passed since David's conviction, and I was still processing the complexity of emotions that came with learning that the person you'd shared a bed with had spent nearly a year planning your murder. The therapeutic sessions I'd been attending helped me understand that my feelings of betrayal and violation were normal, even expected, but they couldn't erase the fundamental shift in how I viewed trust and human relationships. Dr. Sarah Chen, my therapist, had helped me work through the guilt I felt about deceiving David in return. Even though my deception had been motivated by professional caution rather than criminal intent. There were nights when I wondered if I could have prevented the whole situation by being honest about my career from the beginning. But Dr. Chen consistently reminded me that David's choices were his own responsibility. You tested his character by giving him the opportunity to love you for who you appeared to be rather than what you could provide, she'd said during one of our sessions. The fact that he failed that test and chose murder over honest communication tells you everything you need to know about the person he really was. The foundation I'd established with the insurance settlement money had grown beyond my initial expectations. The Martinez Thompson Foundation for Financial Crime Victims now employed 12 full-time staff members and had helped over 300 people rebuild their lives after being targeted by sophisticated fraud schemes. Our offices occupied an entire floor of a downtown building, and we'd expanded our services to include legal advocacy, financial counseling, and specialized therapy for people who'd been victimized by intimate partners involved in financial crimes. The work was emotionally demanding, but it gave purpose to everything I'd experienced during my marriage to David. Maria Santos had transitioned from being my assistant to serving as the foundation's executive director, bringing her investigative skills and understanding of complex financial crimes to help other victims navigate the recovery process. She'd proven to be exceptionally gifted at identifying people who were in situations similar to what I'd experienced, often catching cases before they escalated to attempted murder. "We have a new case that I think you should review personally," Maria told me one morning as she entered my office carrying a thick file folder. Jennifer Walsh, 34, married to a man who's been asking detailed questions about her life insurance coverage and suggesting they take romantic weekend trips to isolated locations. The pattern was familiar, and I felt the familiar surge of protective anger that came with recognizing the signs of predatory behavior. Jennifer's situation reminded me of my own experience, but with some crucial differences that made immediate intervention both possible and necessary. "What's her professional background?" I asked, already reaching for my secure phone to contact Detective Rodriguez. "Elementary school teacher," Maria replied. "No specialized training in financial investigation or self-defense. She's completely vulnerable, and based on our preliminary research, her husband has been in contact with known associates of Vincent Corelli's organization." This meant that Jennifer was facing the same type of professionally planned murder that David had attempted against me, but without any of the resources or expertise that had allowed me to survive and gather evidence. If we didn't intervene quickly, Jennifer Walsh would become another tragic news story about a woman who died in an unfortunate accident while her husband was conveniently absent. Within 2 hours, I was sitting across from Jennifer in a secure conference room, watching her process information that challenged everything she thought she knew about her marriage. She was a small woman with kind eyes and gentle mannerisms, exactly the type of target that predators like David preferred because they appeared vulnerable and unlikely to fight back effectively. "I know this is overwhelming," I said, spreading documentation across the table that showed her husband's financial activities and communications with criminal associates. "But I need you to understand that you're in immediate danger, and we need to take action today to protect you." Jennifer's hands shook as she examined photographs of her husband meeting with men who specialized in arranging accidental deaths. "I can't believe this is real," she whispered. "Marcus has been nothing but loving and supportive. He's been planning a surprise anniversary trip to celebrate our 5 years together." The anniversary trip was almost certainly going to be the location where Marcus planned to kill her, probably using methods that would make her death appear to be a hiking accident or drowning incident. The timeline was frighteningly short, with the trip scheduled for the following weekend. "Jennifer, I need you to listen to me very carefully," I said, leaning forward to establish eye contact. "I was in exactly your situation 8 months ago. My husband had planned my murder down to the smallest detail, and if I hadn't had professional training in detecting financial crimes, I would be dead right now. You don't have time to process this information slowly or hope that there's some innocent explanation." Working with Jennifer over the next 72 hours reminded me of everything I'd learned about the psychology of intimate partner violence and financial exploitation. Marcus had spent months conditioning Jennifer to doubt her own instincts, dismissing her concerns about their financial situation, and making her feel foolish for asking questions about his business activities. But unlike David, Marcus had underestimated his target's capacity for courage when faced with clear evidence of danger. Once Jennifer understood the scope of the threat she was facing, she became a formidable ally in building the case that would save her life and put Marcus in prison. The operation to catch Marcus required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and careful timing to ensure Jennifer's safety while gathering evidence that would support serious criminal charges. We equipped Jennifer with recording devices and surveillance equipment, transforming her from a potential victim into an undercover investigator. "I'm terrified," Jennifer admitted the night before the anniversary trip that would serve as the setting for Marcus's attempted murder. "What if something goes wrong? What if he realizes that I know what he's planning?" "Fear is normal and appropriate in this situation," I told her, remembering my own terror during the final days before David's arrest. "But fear can also be a source of strength if you channel it properly. You're not helpless, and you're not alone. Tomorrow, you're going to help us stop a killer and save your own life in the process." The anniversary trip took place at a remote cabin in the Cascade Mountains, a location that Marcus had chosen because it offered multiple opportunities for fatal accidents with minimal risk of witnesses. But what Marcus didn't know was that the property was surrounded by federal agents and surveillance equipment that would document his every move. Jennifer wore a wire that transmitted everything to our command post, allowing us to monitor the situation in real time and intervene if Marcus's plan showed signs of succeeding. Detective Rodriguez led the tactical team, while I coordinated with prosecutors to ensure that every piece of evidence would be legally admissible in court. The confrontation came sooner than we'd anticipated. Marcus became suspicious when Jennifer asked too many questions about his planned hiking route, and he realized that she was displaying knowledge about wilderness safety that she'd never shown before. Instead of waiting for a carefully staged accident, Marcus decided to kill Jennifer immediately using more direct methods. "You know, don't you?" Marcus said, his voice changing from loving husband to cold predator as he reached for a knife he'd hidden in the cabin's kitchen. "Someone told you about my business arrangements." But Jennifer was ready for this moment, having rehearsed her response during our preparation sessions. Instead of showing fear or trying to deny her knowledge, She looked Marcus directly in the eye and delivered the words that would end his criminal career. "My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I'm working with federal law enforcement to document your conspiracy to commit murder," she said clearly, ensuring that every word was captured by her recording device. "You're under arrest." The arrest team burst through the cabin door within seconds, but Jennifer had already disarmed Marcus using self-defense techniques we'd taught her during our preparation. The woman who had entered that cabin as a potential victim emerged as the primary witness in a federal murder conspiracy case. Marcus was convicted 3 months later and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. But more importantly, Jennifer had discovered strengths and capabilities she'd never known she possessed. She left her teaching job to join our foundation as a victim advocate, using her experience to help other women recognize and escape similar situations. "You saved my life," Jennifer told me after Marcus's sentencing hearing. "But more than that, you showed me who I really am when I stopped letting other people define my worth and capabilities." These words resonated with me because they captured something essential about the journey I'd taken from David's intended victim to a woman who had rebuilt her life around helping others. The experience had forced me to confront fundamental questions about trust, love, and the masks that people wear to hide their true intentions. The media attention surrounding both cases had brought national focus to the issue of intimate partner financial crimes, leading to congressional hearings and new legislation designed to help law enforcement agencies coordinate investigations across state lines. I testified before federal committees, sharing insights about how predators identify and groom their targets. But the most meaningful recognition came from the hundreds of people who contacted our foundation after reading about our work. Letters from women who recognized warning signs in their own relationships, from men who realized they'd been targeted by financial predators, from family members who finally understood what had happened to loved ones who died in supposedly accidental circumstances. One letter particularly stayed with me, from a woman named Patricia whose sister had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, under circumstances that had never made sense to the family. "After reading about your case, I realized that my sister's husband had taken out multiple life insurance policies just months before her death," Patricia wrote. "The police said it was just a tragic accident, but now I'm wondering if there was more to investigate. Can you help us find the truth?" These cases became a significant part of our foundation's work, partnering with law enforcement agencies to examine suspicious deaths that had been classified as accidents but showed patterns consistent with deliberate planning. We'd helped solve 6 cold cases in the past year, bringing closure to families and justice to perpetrators who thought they'd committed perfect crimes. The psychological impact of this work was complex, forcing me to balance the satisfaction of helping others with the emotional toll of constantly immersing myself in stories of betrayal and violence. Dr. Chen continued to help me process these experiences, particularly the challenge of maintaining trust in human relationships while being professionally focused on detecting deception. "You've created something meaningful from your trauma," she observed during one of our sessions. "But you also need to make sure you're not defining your entire identity around being a survivor. You're allowed to have experiences and relationships that aren't connected to your work or your past with David." This advice led me to make changes in my personal life that I hadn't anticipated when I first started the foundation. I began dating again, carefully and slowly, but with a new appreciation for authentic connection and honest communication. The men I met now knew about my work from the beginning, understanding that I was someone who specialized in uncovering deception and wouldn't tolerate even small lies or manipulations. I also reconnected with friendships that had been neglected during my marriage to David, relationships with people who had known me before I'd learned to construct elaborate covers for my professional activities. These connections reminded me of who I'd been before I became defined by my experience as a crime victim and survivor. The second anniversary of David's arrest approached on a crisp October morning that reminded me of the day I'd first discovered my severed brake lines. But instead of feeling anxiety or fear, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment and purpose. The woman who had sat in that garage listening to her husband lie about accidentally cutting her brake lines had become someone who could protect others from experiencing similar betrayals. Maria knocked on my office door, carrying the morning's mail and wearing the expression that meant she had important news to share. "We just received confirmation that the Department of Justice wants to establish a national task force focused on intimate partner financial crimes," she said, setting a formal letter on my desk. "They're asking you to serve as the civilian coordinator, working directly with federal agencies to develop training programs and investigation protocols." This opportunity represented validation of everything we'd built since David's conviction, recognition that our work had identified systemic problems that required coordinated federal response. But it also meant expanding our mission beyond individual cases to influence policy and training at the national level. "What do you think?" Maria asked, knowing that I valued her perspective on major decisions affecting the Foundation's direction. "I think it's exactly what we've been working toward," I replied, remembering the isolated fear I'd felt during those final weeks before David's arrest. "If we can prevent other women from going through what Jennifer and I experienced, then everything we've learned will have served its purpose." That evening, I stood in my new apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. The space was smaller than the house I'd shared with David, but it felt infinitely larger because it belonged entirely to me. No hidden agendas, no carefully constructed deceptions, no fear that the person I loved most was planning my death. The work I'd chosen was difficult and sometimes emotionally devastating, but it had given me something that my marriage to David never could have provided: the knowledge that I was exactly who I was meant to be. Strong enough to survive betrayal, smart enough to outmaneuver professional criminals, and compassionate enough to help others find their own strength when their worlds collapsed around them. My phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Rodriguez, asking if I wanted to join her team for drinks to celebrate the successful conclusion of another case. These friendships with law enforcement professionals had become an important part of my support network. Relationships built on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice rather than deception and manipulation. As I prepared to leave for the evening, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and was struck by how different I looked compared to the woman who had played the role of David's naive wife. Not just older or more experienced, but fundamentally transformed in ways that went beyond external appearance. I was Rebecca Martinez Thompson, and I had learned that true strength doesn't come from avoiding difficult truths or accepting other people's definitions of who you should be. It comes from facing reality with clear eyes, trusting your instincts even when they conflict with your emotions, and refusing to let anyone convince you that you're less capable than you actually are. David had cut my brake lines by mistake, believing he was dealing with a helpless woman who would never see his deception coming. Instead, he'd revealed his true character to someone who specialized in exposing exactly the kind of crimes he was planning to commit. I cut his future, his freedom, and his ability to hurt anyone else on purpose, using skills and resources he never knew I possessed. The only mistake in our story was his assumption that intelligence and strength always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who lets everyone else underestimate her capabilities. And sometimes the greatest victory comes from proving that underestimation was the biggest mistake they ever made. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. buzzed with activity as senators and representatives filed into the hearing room for what would become landmark testimony on intimate partner financial crimes. 3 years had passed since David's conviction, and the ripple effects of our case had grown into a national movement that was reshaping how law enforcement approached domestic violence involving sophisticated financial schemes. I adjusted the microphone in front of me, looking out at the packed gallery filled with journalists, law enforcement officials, and survivors of similar crimes. The weight of representing hundreds of victims felt both humbling and empowering, as I prepared to deliver testimony that could influence federal policy for decades to come. Senator Margaret Collins, who chaired the Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime and Terrorism, called the hearing to order with words that captured the significance of the moment. "We're here today because traditional approaches to domestic violence prevention have failed to address the sophisticated financial predators who use marriage and intimate relationships as cover for elaborate murder schemes," she began. "Our witness today, Rebecca Martinez Thompson, has not only survived such an attempt on her life, but has built a national network dedicated to identifying and stopping these crimes before they claim more victims." The testimony I delivered that morning drew from case files representing over 800 individuals who had contacted our foundation after recognizing warning signs in their own relationships. The patterns were consistent across geographic regions, socioeconomic backgrounds, and demographic categories, suggesting that intimate partner financial predation was far more widespread than anyone had previously understood. The average financial predator spends 18 months grooming their target before attempting murder, I explained to the committee, referring to research our foundation had conducted in partnership with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. They systematically isolate their victims from support networks, create financial dependence, and construct elaborate cover stories that make their eventual crimes appear to be tragic accidents rather than deliberate homicides. What made these cases particularly challenging for traditional law enforcement was the sophisticated nature of the planning involved. Unlike crimes of passion or opportunity, intimate partner financial predation required extensive preparation, professional consultation, and careful timing. The perpetrators were often intelligent, charming individuals who appeared to be model citizens in their communities. Congressman Robert Hayes from Texas raised concerns about the constitutional implications of investigating people based on seemingly innocent behaviors, like taking out life insurance policies or asking questions about their spouse's routines. "Mrs. Thompson, how do we balance the need to protect potential victims with the rights of individuals who may be engaging in perfectly legal activities?" he asked. This question went to the heart of the challenge we faced in developing prevention strategies. The early warning signs of intimate partner financial predation often looked identical to normal relationship behaviors, making it difficult to identify genuine threats without appearing to criminalize routine marital activities. "The key is pattern recognition rather than individual behaviors," I replied, pulling up a presentation that illustrated the progression from normal relationship dynamics to predatory planning. No single action indicates criminal intent, but when multiple behaviors appear together within specific timeframes, they create profiles that trained investigators can recognize and investigate appropriately. The foundation had developed a risk assessment tool that scored relationships based on combinations of financial, behavioral, and communication patterns. Couples with high scores weren't automatically reported to law enforcement, but they were offered resources and support services that could help them address underlying problems before they escalated to violence. Senator Collins asked about the success rate of our intervention programs, and I was able to report statistics that validated our approach. Of the 300 high-risk cases we'd identified and addressed through early intervention, none had resulted in attempted murder, and 87% had led to criminal investigations that uncovered other fraudulent activities. What's particularly significant, I explained, is that many of these cases involved perpetrators who were simultaneously targeting multiple victims. By stopping one planned murder, we often prevented several other crimes that were in various stages of development. The hearing continued for over 4 hours, with committee members asking detailed questions about implementation costs, training requirements, and coordination between federal and local agencies. The complexity of the issue required solutions that spanned multiple government departments and addressed everything from insurance regulation to banking oversight. During a recess, I was approached by Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a psychiatrist who had been studying the psychological profiles of intimate partner financial predators for the National Institute of Mental Health. "Your testimony has been extraordinary," she said, "but I'm curious about something you haven't addressed directly. How has this work affected your own ability to trust and form intimate relationships?" It was a question I'd been expecting. and one that reflected the personal cost of dedicating my life to exposing the worst aspects of human nature. The honest answer was complicated, involving ongoing therapeutic work and careful attention to my own psychological well-being. I've learned to distinguish between healthy skepticism and paranoid suspicion, I replied. My work has made me more aware of warning signs, but it's also shown me that genuine love and respect create patterns that are easily distinguishable from predatory behavior. The challenge is maintaining that distinction while remaining vigilant. The truth was that my personal life had evolved in ways I hadn't anticipated when I first established the foundation. I'd been in a relationship with Dr. Michael Chen, a trauma surgeon at Seattle Children's Hospital, for over a year. Michael knew about my work from our first conversation, understood the demands of my schedule, and had proven himself to be someone whose words consistently matched his actions. What made our relationship work was transparency rather than mystery, mutual support rather than dependence, and respect for each other's professional commitments rather than attempts to control or limit them. Michael had actually become one of our foundation's medical consultants, helping us understand the physical evidence patterns associated with staged accidents and suspicious deaths. The afternoon session focused on legislative proposals that would provide federal funding for training programs, create standardized investigation protocols, and establish victim support services in all 50 states. The potential impact was enormous, but so was the political challenge of building bipartisan support for complex legislation that addressed issues many lawmakers didn't fully understand. Representative Sarah Kim from California, who had co-sponsored the proposed legislation, asked about implementation timelines and budget requirements. Based on our pilot programs in Washington, Oregon, and Colorado, I explained, we estimate that a national rollout would require initial funding of approximately $50 million, with ongoing annual costs of $25 million for training, technology, and victim services. These numbers seemed large until compared to the economic impact of the crimes we were working to prevent. Insurance fraud related to intimate partner violence cost the industry over $2 billion annually, while the broader economic impact on families and communities was incalculable. Senator Collins concluded the hearing by announcing that the committee would be drafting comprehensive legislation based on the testimony and evidence presented, with the goal of introducing the Intimate Partner Financial Crime Prevention Act during the next legislative session. Mrs. Thompson, your courage in surviving your own victimization and transforming that experience into a force for protecting others represents the best of American resilience and determination, she said. This committee is committed to ensuring that your work receives the federal support it deserves. The weeks following the congressional hearing brought a flood of media attention that both amplified our message and created new challenges for our organization. News outlets across the country ran features about intimate partner financial predation, leading to thousands of calls from people who were concerned about their own relationships or wanted to report suspicious deaths of family members. The volume of responses overwhelmed our existing staff capacity, forcing us to rapidly expand our operations and develop new protocols for triaging cases based on urgency and available evidence. Maria had proven to be exceptionally skilled at managing this growth, transforming our small foundation into a sophisticated operation that could handle complex investigations while maintaining the personal touch that made our work effective. One case that came to our attention during this period particularly demonstrated the national scope of the problem we were addressing. Linda Morrison, a nurse from Phoenix, contacted us after recognizing patterns in her marriage that matched those described in news coverage of our work. Linda's husband, Robert, was a successful architect who had recently begun asking detailed questions about her work schedule at the hospital, suggesting romantic getaways to isolated locations, and taking out substantial life insurance policies that he claimed were necessary for tax planning purposes. I probably wouldn't have thought anything of it, Linda told me during our initial phone conversation. But the news stories about your case made me realize that all these things were happening at the same time, just like you described in your Testimony. What made Linda's situation particularly urgent was the timeline involved. Robert had planned a weekend trip to a remote cabin in Montana for the following month, and our preliminary investigation revealed that he had been in contact with individuals who had connections to organized crime families specializing in contract killings. Working with federal agents in Arizona and Montana, we developed an intervention strategy that would protect Linda while gathering evidence that could support serious criminal charges against Robert. The operation required careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and precise timing to ensure Linda's safety while building a prosecutable case. Linda proved to be a courageous and effective partner in the investigation, wearing recording devices and following scripted conversations that revealed Robert's criminal intentions without alerting him to the fact that he was under surveillance. The planned weekend trip became the setting for Robert's arrest, with federal agents documenting his attempt to stage what would have appeared to be a hiking accident that claimed Linda's life. The evidence gathered during the operation was overwhelming, leading to Robert's conviction on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and his sentencing to 30 years in federal prison. But Linda's case also revealed something that was becoming increasingly clear through our work. Intimate partner financial predation was often connected to broader criminal networks that specialized in providing murder-for-hire services to clients who wanted their spouses eliminated for financial gain. This discovery led to expanded collaboration with federal agencies investigating organized crime, helping to identify and dismantle networks that had been operating across multiple states for years. Our foundation had evolved from a victim support organization into a crucial component of federal law enforcement efforts to combat sophisticated criminal enterprises. The personal cost of this work continued to be significant, requiring ongoing attention to my own psychological well-being and that of our staff members. We'd instituted mandatory counseling services for everyone involved in active investigations, recognizing that constant exposure to stories of betrayal and violence could create secondary trauma that affected judgment and personal relationships. Dr. Chen had helped me understand that my commitment to helping others was both a source of strength and a potential source of obsession that could consume my entire identity if I wasn't careful to maintain boundaries between my professional and personal life. "You've built something extraordinary," she told me during one of our sessions. "But you also need to remember that your value as a human being isn't dependent on your work or your ability to save everyone who contacts your foundation." This advice became particularly relevant as the 5th anniversary of David's arrest approached. Media outlets were planning retrospective coverage of the case and its impact on federal policy, while our foundation was preparing to release a comprehensive report on intimate partner financial predation that would influence law enforcement training for years to come. The night before the anniversary, I found myself standing in the same location where I'd first discovered my severed brake lines, now serving as the parking lot of a community center that hosted support groups for domestic violence survivors. The symbolism wasn't lost on me as I prepared to deliver a keynote address to a national conference of victim advocates and law enforcement professionals. The woman who had stood in that garage 5 years earlier, listening to her husband lie about accidentally cutting her brake lines, had become someone who could influence federal policy and help protect thousands of potential victims. But more importantly, she had learned that true strength comes not from avoiding vulnerability, but from transforming it into a source of power that can lift others up. My phone buzzed with a text message from Michael, who was finishing his shift at the hospital and planning to join me for the conference dinner. "Proud of you," the message read. "See you soon." These simple words carried weight because they came from someone who knew the full scope of my work and its emotional demands, someone who had chosen to build a relationship based on honesty, rather than the careful deceptions that had characterized my marriage to David. As I walked toward the community center where hundreds of people were gathering to hear about survival, justice, and the possibility of transforming trauma into purpose, I realized that the journey from victim to advocate had taught me something fundamental about human resilience. We are all stronger than we know, more capable than others assume, and more valuable than anyone who seeks to diminish or destroy us can ever understand. The challenge isn't avoiding people who might hurt us, but developing the wisdom to recognize genuine love and respect when they appear in our lives. I am Rebecca Martinez Thompson, and I learned that the most powerful response to betrayal isn't revenge or withdrawal, but the decision to use your experience to ensure that others don't have to endure what you survived. David cut my brake lines, by mistake, thinking he was dealing with someone who would never see his deception coming. I cut his future, his freedom, and his ability to harm anyone else on purpose, using every skill and resource I possessed to ensure that justice was served. But the real victory wasn't his defeat. It was the discovery that surviving the worst someone can do to you can become the foundation for the best you can do for others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.